Hello, my name is Professor Barrett from the University of Dundee in Scotland, and today I'm going to talk to you about getting your clinical and laboratory data published in a high quality journal. And the reason why I say high quality journal is it's quite easy to get your data published anywhere, and what we're talking about here is high quality journal which will be respected by your peers and your fellow colleagues. I'm also in this presentation going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'll give you about 45 seconds to answer those questions, and we can discuss this at the Q&A session at the end. I don't believe I have any significant conflicts of interests as a disclosure to actually change the way that I would present the information to you today. I'm a fully employed member of the University of Dundee, where I get 100% of my salary. I have received honorarium, for example, and expenses to do studies or be parts of editorial boards in the past. I've been on editor-in-chief of Molecular Human Reproduction and deputy editor-in-chief of Molecular Human Reproduction. I'm a current editorial board member of Physiological Reviews, which is a reviews journal outside of reproductive medicine. And I've been provided with an honorarium to prepare all the information related to the lectures that I'm giving you at the moment. I think it's important to say that all these opinions are my own. If somebody else was giving you this lecture, they'd give it in a very different way and you'd get different messages from that. In this lecture, I'll be going through asking you one question, which relates to how to write a paper and the time it would take to do that. I will discuss the large number of resources that are available to you, freely available. And for this, you should arm yourself. I call this the 6 Ps, which is prior planning and preparation, prevents poor performance. I will discuss what are the journals looking for and how to judge this. I think this is very important because basically there's a lot of information out there on the journals and the websites that you can actually look at, digest, and find out what the journals are looking for. I will then discuss how best to prepare your paper. And of course, the inevitable will come at some stage when you'll have to deal with a revise, resubmit, and maybe even a rejection. And it's important that you understand how to deal with that. Of course, science is definitely a business where you're in, and you're going to receive a lot of rejections, I would imagine, for grants, jobs, for papers, etc. So it's important to know how to deal with these. And of course, what are the key reasons for rejection? Are there sort of reasons that you can pick out the generic that you can hopefully deal with before you actually need to submit your paper? And even when your paper is accepted, it's not the end. Post-acceptance and publication are important things you still need to do to make sure that your paper actually gets as most attention as possible. There are many different types of papers, reviews, editorials, but I'm going to primarily focus on data papers. And don't forget, writing papers is very different to writing a grant. People often say it's the same. The massive difference between it is, of course, is a grant, once it's read and examined by referees, is pretty much chucked in the bin, whereas a paper stands, of course, the test of time. So my experience in publishing papers comes from both sides of the fence. I've been, for example, an author. I've written a number of primary papers, and these papers have been in general journals, for example, in The Lancet. And I've also written a number of papers, for example, in the key reproductive journals such as Fertility and Sterility, Human Reproduction, MHR. So I've got considerable experience in publishing what's deemed to be the best journals in the field. Moreover, I've got experience of editorial boards, and I've done that for quite a long time now, from andrology to biology reproduction to human reproduction update. And importantly, I think I've been editor-in-chief of MHR, and I'm now currently an editor of RBMO. And what this gives me is some experience of the other side of the fence. And I think it's very important to have both perspectives to try and help people guide you in how to publish papers, because it is not a simple process. So here's my first question I'm going to ask you, and I want to be very clear about the detail that I'm asking you. I am asking you specifically, how long in the number of hours, and that's counted up continuously, does it take to actually write a paper? And what I mean by that is that if you've got all of the information in front of you, all of the figures are done, the data's been analyzed, the statistics have been done, the references are there, all the permissions you need are there, all you've got to do is sit down and write that paper. Now, what I mean here is you'll often have more than one version of the paper. You'll need to show it to your colleagues and get feedback from them. So if you count up all of those hours, what I'm asking you to say is how long does it take you actually to write that paper and then finally submit it, i.e. press send. So I've given you some options here, 10 hours, up to 30 hours, up to 75 hours, up to 150 hours, or 100, 350 hours. And these are continuous hours. So if you have a break over the weekend, you don't count that. This is continuous work that you would do. Or actually, are you not sure? So I'll give you about 40 seconds to sort of have a look at that and complete that survey, and we can discuss it in question and answers. Okay, let's move on then. So importantly, when you come to write a paper, get all your data together, look to submission to a journal, it's very important to understand that there are a huge number of resources available to you. Not just your colleagues or your collaborators or friends, there's a plethora of information for you. So, for example, at ESHRE, where they have the academic authorship program, for example, under the educational resource, which is on the internet, they have a very large number of lectures, anything from how to present your data, how to design your study, what referees are looking for, what journals are looking for, what happens if you get your paper rejected. And these are all workshop videos with PowerPoint presentations. And there's a large number of them. There's about 40 of them that you could look through. And they are a fantastic resource. They usually give the lectures given by previous editors or current editors, referees, and of course, all of these people at the same time are authors. So I'd strongly, strongly recommend you look at that as a resource. The other is that actually the journals themselves. The journals are very, very keen to get your paper, and they will often give you very strong guidance and help, assistance in preparing your paper. So, for example, if you look at the Elsevier website, there's a huge, in the Research Academy section, there is a massive section with videos and help in how to prepare your research, how to write your research, what is the publication process. All of this information is available to you basically for free. So you need to be able to use this information and arm yourself with what's going on. Other journals do the same thing. So for example, this is from PLOS. This is how to write your methods. So for example, if you're stuck, or how do I actually put my methods together to be the best they can, look at this resource. And that is really helpful for you to do this. There's also books on how to write papers. I've picked this one from Jack Coyne and Graham Medley because this book is highly readable. It contains mainly experiments from reproductive biology. Jack was a reproductive biologist. And actually this book goes through the process of how to write your introduction, how you might write your discussion, but also it looks at how to design your experiments. In this particular presentation, we're just looking at publishing a paper, but of course, you've done all the experiments before you come to publish the paper. So it is important that you think of it as a continuum. And this is an interesting and highly readable book to look at this particular subject. Okay, now let's take a look at what we can learn from the journals to help prepare our paper. The first thing we're going to look at is actually how the flow of manuscripts works in the journals. So now let's look at the basic flow of a manuscript in a particular journal. Now, journals vary quite considerably between how they process manuscripts, but I think this gives us a general idea of basically how a manuscript would move throughout a journal. So sometimes there is actually necessary a pre-submission inquiry to the editor. And in this, for example, eLife. So for here, you would need to actually submit what you believe are the key salient points, and in fact, sometimes even key data points, to the editor prior hand to see whether your manuscript actually is suitable for the journal. Let's presume, for argument's sake, that that's not necessary, and in most reproduction journals that isn't necessary. What the process that paper goes through is, first of all, it will go to the editor. And that may be several people working with the editor, and they'll then determine whether the paper is in scope. For example, if the paper is to go to MHR, molecular human reproduction, they're particularly interested in the mechanisms of studies and cells and biology. If your study is just a report rather than containing any mechanism, it's unlikely that actually that paper would be suitable for that journal. So it's possible that the editor would say, look, I'm sorry, this is not the journal for you. So that is a key event. That's positive because it prevents you wasting a lot of time going through the whole process. The editors also ask very important generic questions. So, for example, do I care? And actually, this sounds rather silly to ask, but in reality, it's very important because what you're saying when you write a paper, you want people then to read the paper and then action on the information in that paper. But actually, if they've read the paper and 100 people read the paper and think, yeah, it doesn't make any difference to anything, then actually that paper will have limited impact. And the editor and the editorial board may actually determine that prior to actually your paper going for refereeing. Generally, the system then will allow some sort of associate editor making a judgment call. So it's been through the editor, and then it will maybe go to an associate editor. They then determine whether it goes out to reviewers. And in general, you can select your reviewers, for example. And in general, people have 2 reviews of a paper, sometimes 3, depending on the nature of the paper. Now, while you can select for reviewers, you can also select against them. So for example, if you think a person is highly competitive to your ideas and doesn't like any of the ideas and just basically would say no to everything, then you can actually tell the journal that. If you think a referee would be particularly positive to you, for example, your pal who lives down the road, then you could select that referee, for example. However, having been on the other side of the fence, i.e. from the journal's point of view, I can categorically tell you that that is not a system that works particularly well. For example, you might select your best pal to actually referee the paper. They may say, oh, I'm really looking forward to refereeing that paper, put my name down. And they do a real hatchet job on the paper because actually they won't tell you they've done it. So it's not always your pals who actually help you out. So I would be very, very cautious about recommending your pals. And on the opposite side of the fence, somebody might not agree with your ideas and they may not like some of the sort of thought process you have, but actually they may respect you for doing that. And actually they could give you a very fair review, even though they may not agree with you. So I would be cautious about selecting referees based on some sort of bias. Okay, let's now assume that the paper's gone out for referees. It's then collated by the associate editor or sometimes the editor. They then pass that information back to you. And of course, they've got a number of options. Reject the paper, this is just not going to make progress. It can have a major or a minor recommendations. That's for changes that can easily be done. A major one can sometimes involve an extra experiment, for example. They will also look at scientific fraud, reproducibility, etc. And they also look at plagiarism, which is actually detecting, sometimes using software, for example. And the associate editor hopefully then will provide a synthesis and key points to address. And hopefully this will be the important ones you need to do, and the more trivial ones. So you should know when you get your paper back exactly what you need to do if it's on minor or particularly major corrections. The associate editor will also look at the originality and the scientific soundness of the paper. And often this can internally get a score. So for example, it could have a score out of 1 out of 5, 5 being, this is outstanding, 2 being, yeah, it's okay, it's all right. Sometimes a paper will get rejected even though it's scientifically sound, but actually it's just average. Its originality is average, etc., etc. So although there's nothing inherent wrong with the experiments or the process that you've gone through, it's just not judged to be original enough. And that hopefully could be picked up by the editor in the very beginning in an ideal world. I very strongly recommend you check the Journal World Wide Web sites and the instructions to authors. ITA is instructions to authors, by the way. And what you're getting from them is clarity about what is in your paper and how it's presented to them. For example, if the journal says, look, and this is hypothetical, of course, if over the next 3 months, all we're going to concentrate is on papers on sperm, then if you've got an egg paper, don't submit it. Okay, now that is an extreme puerile example, but it means you need to read the World Wide Web and the ITA related to those. And that is really important. And I can guarantee you most people don't. And that is a fundamental error of judgment. There is also checklists that are available, and this is a checklist for referees on how to review manuscripts. But of course, you can basically use all of this information here to cross-check with your paper. So for example, if you're looking at the results in the discussion of your paper, this is what the referee would be looking at. So for example, your figures and your tables need to be very clear and explained very easily of what messages you're getting through. And of course, the referee has a checklist here, so that's one of the things they're going to look at. So it's very important, for example, that you could get this information beforehand and double check it against your paper. Specific journals have set criteria. So, for example, this comes from the journal Science, and this is the advice for referees. And this is their criteria for judgment. So actually, you know that the referees are going to be getting this piece of paper. So what is important for you, and very important for you, is you cross-check against these criteria to see where your article comes. So for example, the research article should report a major breakthrough. 20% of the papers that Science publishes, is it in the top 20% of papers that Science publishes? And it should have strong interdisciplinary research or be of unusual interest to the specialist. So if your paper is in the bottom 10% of papers that you think will be published in Science, it's unlikely that it's going to get in. So you need to think about that before you take the trouble to submit to journals. Because the very important thing is actually submitting a paper to a journal takes a massive amount of effort. And as a consequence, you don't want to be wasting this effort. You need to maximize your effort. So therefore, you don't want to be wasting time. The next question you're going to be faced with is actually, what journal am I going to submit it to? Now, sometimes this can be guided for you. For example, if you're a student or a junior faculty member, you can have really quite strong direction from your colleagues of where you have to publish papers. I think ideally you should try and resist that if you can. It's not always possible, and I appreciate that. But really what you've got to think about is, I've spent all this time doing these experiments. It's taken me ages to write the papers up. actually, who do I want to read it? What audience am I really looking for? And actually, it's very important then to think about what journal does that. So, for example, some journals, even in reproduction, may not be too keen on getting a paper on contraception. As an example, if you then have got a study on contraception, you might think really quite clearly, well, do I need to publish it in Journal X? Because they don't really publish a lot of contraception, whereas Journal Y does. Therefore, I'd be better off in Journal Y. So it is important to think about where you're going to publish your papers. Generally, you've got to think about the audience. Now, of course, I do believe there is a minimum standard in reproductive medicine and biology. So you do have to look at journals that have got a good circulation and a good reputation. But there is plenty of choice out there. So you should pick which one you think is the best one for you. For example, if you look at the estrus journals, then MHR is generally based on a mechanism type paper, whereas human reproduction is a much more clinical paper. So again, even within the same stable of journals, you've got choices of where to go. And particularly if you're involved in an ART clinic, you might be better placed looking at a clinical journal where the maximum impact will actually be. So let's assume you've thought about, I'm going to try and publish it in fertility and sterility, for example. You've then got to prepare your paper. Now, again, advice varies, but I always think, as I've mentioned, a good covering letter is important. And what you can do, in fact, with this covering letter is send it to the editors before you send your manuscript to try and pre-warn them or get some guidance from them. For example, they may have had 50 papers in the last week on COVID and testicular function. So maybe they're not looking for number 51. So they may say, well, actually, we're just swamped by this. So you might be better off putting in another journal. Or they may say, look, we've got technical issues at the moment. It's taken us 4 weeks to referee instead of 2. Something. But it's often worthwhile contacting the editors. And pretty well much they're very keen on getting high quality papers. So when you start to put your paper together, you've got to really, really think about how this paper is presented. It's not just writing stuff. That just will not work under any circumstances. And it's often best to have a very clear experiment, a very clear hypothesis with relatively clear results, and that makes writing a paper really easy. Writing a paper when your boss comes to you and says, look, I've got some data, see if you can get it published. It's basically, you're on a hide into nothing with that one. You're trying to make a story when there isn't really any story. So having a clear hypothesis, having a good experimental design is very important. And that actually, when you emphasize in the paper, really leads a reader. So don't forget, there's another person who is reading this paper, and they're the referee, and they will in fact be then the reader in the journal. So you're taking their time by them reading it. So you've got to try and make life easy for them. You've got to think about what's the impact of your data and what it really means. And I think the way to think about this is, what type of study am I trying to publish? Is it this is another study in a particular area which adds to evidence? Or is it a study which is really important for repeatability and reliability? So that might be a particular emphasis. You would need to emphasize that in your paper. But whatever you do, this is the most important thing that you can do. What I mean by this is that you've got to make it that your referee doesn't work. Now, what I mean by that is simply that you just want to engage the referee on an intellectual basis. You do not want, under any circumstances whatsoever, your referee to fight to have to understand the data. So, for example, if they're looking at a figure and they think, I don't understand that figure, that is a really bad place for you as an author to be. And there is no reason for it. A simple bit of work and you can make that figure easily accessible to the referee. So at the very worst case scenario, You've got to make your paper what I call neutral. So the referee reads it, maybe doesn't think it's War and Peace or whatever, but really gets the message and thinks it's clear. And then you've engaged them intellectually. That's exactly where you need to be. Because if you complicate the message at all, you're finished in most cases. And I've put a little picture of a wee guy in a bath here because, in general, referees will not always be looking at your paper when they're very relaxed, they're feeling fantastic, there's a rose garden outside, and their husband and or their wife is basically everything's rosy and the kids are happy, etc. Sometimes they'll be reading it in the middle of the night, they've just had a long flight, the plane's been delayed, a dog comes up and bites you, the bath has gone cold. You think you get the message. Basically, therefore, you've really, really, really got to make this message clear to them. And that is fundamentally important. Now, Richard Sharp from the University of Edinburgh writes just incredible papers to read. And I've stolen this from Richard. This is basically his criteria for writing a paper. And they're golden rules, as he calls them. And he's dead right with these. So the storyline is critical. You've got to have a story. Somebody's reading something. You're not sitting next to him. You can't explain it. You've got to have this storyline going through it. Presentation is fundamental. If your message is ambiguous, you're going to kill the referee off. They just will not know where they're coming or going. And complexity is another. Something that's intellectually challenging can still be easy to read. You need to have the complexity in the intellectual challenge, not in the message. And that is a big difference. Never confuse interpretation with evidence. So if you're interpreting something, just say that, Say if it's speculation, but make it clear you're doing that. And at the end, you must have a balanced approach to your data. And that's a clear winner. And I think Richard's dead right when he talks to that one there. There are often more than one possibility to the data that you've got and the experiment conclusion you've come to. That's great. That's part of science. But don't just sort of give your main approach and say that that's the only approach, because it will probably annoy the referee and won't help you at all. So when you've got your referee your paper just about to send, you may then consider actually posting it on a pre-print server. And you've seen this, for example, in the COVID crisis. Often papers are submitted to journals, and at the same time they're submitted on a pre-print server, so that they are immediately available, with the huge caveat that it hasn't been refereed yet, but it's instantly available. So one of the examples to use, and this is the BioReview preprint server for biology run by Cold Spring Harbor, but there are others. So it would be important for you to have a look at that and see whether you think it's important for your data to actually get there, and would that help you at all. So let's assume now you've gone through that process and you've submitted your paper. Now you have to wait. I am terribly bad at waiting. As soon as I submit a paper, I want an instant answer. That's unfortunately not always possible. So you just do have to wait. And this can be really quite an anxious process. You're checking your emails, checking the post as it used to be in the old days, and you are desperate to find out what's happening to this paper. Then it arrives in the email, and of course your adrenaline's pretty high when you're opening the email. Now, inevitably, as part of science, you're going to get papers rejected. If you can't take criticism, of your papers, then you're in the wrong job and you need to get out right now. So you're just going to get it. That's the nature of the beast. It's not a personal criticism. It's just criticism of your data and your work. It's not directed at you, of course. It's related to the subject. So if you get a paper rejected or it's severe, revise and resubmit, my strong advice to you is give it time to cool off. Pick it up, put the email, in the drawer, leave it for a couple of days, chat to your pals, and come back. Do not write instantly back to the editor. What are you doing? How come you rejected my paper? Don't you know who I am? And I've had papers like that where I've received those type of emails when I've been the editor. I've even had phone calls at home from people saying, what are you doing rejecting my paper? And obviously that doesn't help your case much. So if it actually is a true reject, it's not revise and resubmit, it's a true reject, you can actually appeal, of course, but generally it's appeal against a process. Unless in the extreme example, the referees have read the wrong paper and it can't go on. So it's very important for you to check another journal, probably if it's a complete reject. So what are the reasons for rejection? Well, Elsevier on their website give you reasons for rejection, and it's actually quite important that you look at these beforehand because it will help you in writing your paper. So, for example, P. Thrower from the Elsevier website looks at this information and says, there are critical things that I really reject papers on. So, for example, it's incomplete, it's defective analysis, conclusion is not justified, and we just talked about that. It is a small extension, it's not really helping science at all. It's incomprehensible, I had no idea what they're trying to tell me, and I read 30 pages. Or, I'm falling asleep after 2 pages. So you need to think about those things before you submit your paper. You know all this now. We've told you all this now. So make sure you understand that and you can go through it in that detail. But let's assume, for argument's sake, that you've got your paper back, but they haven't rejected it. But they've done a lot of points you've got to address. So it's a revise and resubmit basically. This is really, really important because you are almost there. Most papers never make it to this stage, of course. So you're almost there. So it is really important you keep your cool. Okay, you and your team need to be very cool. You might be angry, but you've got to be cool about how you deal with this. So you've got to be courteous and firm about how you reply. You've got to stick to the science. Don't get stuck into sort of opinions about this, that, and the other. In fact, what you've got to do is you've got to do a forensic job on your own paper and also for the referee's comments. And when it's opinion from you or them, say so. That's okay, but don't overstep the mark. Make sure you answer the question fully and in a comprehensive manner. So if they have 10 points, don't answer 5 of them and forget to answer the other 5. Answer all 10. And really importantly, if you say I've changed figure 3, make sure you've changed figure 3 on your revised paper. Don't forget to do that because that's really a schoolboy error really. And try and be informative. Your job is to assist the referee now. The referee's taken the trouble to referee your paper, being pretty excited about it, but got lots of questions. You now need to help them get over that last fence. Your job is to help the referee. And generally, you will only have one chance at doing this. And that's really important to do that. Let me give you an example. This is a paper that we wrote. We had back from the referees basically saying, as one of the comments on about potassium channel paper, it is not clear why or how the authors conclude that a shift in channel regulation in patients is due to A, B, or C. You know what? The referee was dead right. So the reviewer, you're correct. We actually don't know that. And then we put the speculation and we say it's in the revised manuscript on line 323 and it's been highlighted. You need to do that for each and every point that they bring up. And I think, it can be 8 or 9 pages that you send in as a response, but make it clear for the referee. That is a critical thing to do. Okay, let's now assume it's been accepted. Everybody is absolutely ecstatic, but actually that isn't the end of the job, really. You've got other bits to do to make sure that this paper really has a big impact. You have to check the proofs carefully. For example, a number of journals copy edit things now and to try and help and make things clearer. Sometimes they completely change the significance of sentences. And actually, you need to check it because not checking is just not good enough. And really, really, really importantly, you need to make sure the title is the best it can be. It's absolutely essential. This is the advert for the paper. Most people just go on PubMed and look at the title. If the title's as dull as ditch water, they are not going to read the paper unless they are completely into the subject. You've got to make the title attractive. That doesn't mean to say you just flower it. It just means you've got to really think about a short, snappy title. Check you've got all your attributions and acknowledgements right, because sometimes when you're putting a paper together, you're so focused on the science and the construction of the discussion and the tables, you actually perhaps don't pay full attention to acknowledgements and all the people who have helped you, including funders. Do not miss a funder off a paper. That is a fatal error. You need to put your ethics and your IRB, for example, numbers. And increasingly, you're going to have to make all of the data available at some stage. And you need to think about that, in fact, before you publish your paper, but certainly before it actually gets out into the world, into the wide world. You need that data to be available. So basically, somebody can come on the next day and say, can you send me all the data? Because I want to have a look at it. And pretty well much you'll need to send the data. And that's a good thing, you know? You'll need to think about open access, for example. It may improve the visibility of your journal. It might be a paper. It may cost you more money, though, depending on the journal, and that might be a choice why you choose one journal versus the other. But it's likely to improve your visibility in some cases. So have a think about whether you want a fully open access, as an example. Post-publication is a very important one because actually once you get to this stage, it's critical to think, I've published it, it's out there, job done. You know what? It's not the job done. You've got to think about how you then pass this to the lay public, for example. What about social media, tweeting people, look, I just got a paper published, it's on this, you know, you might be interested. What about general media? What about a graphical abstract? This is used by, for example, the Cell Press journals, and some of them are really impressive. They really put in a nutshell exactly what the paper's about. You might want to present your paper at a conference, for example. Some people do this the other way about. They actually present at a conference and then they write a paper. My advice to you is do it the other way about, if the conference rules will allow that, for example. I wouldn't advise that you then contact your main rivals and say, here's my paper, here's another 10 papers I've written, and I deliver them in a box to you. That's sort of not very helpful. Although, of course, that does happen sometimes. But just because it's published, the game is not over. You're still in the game. You've still got lots of work to do. So it is a big job. Don't forget that the journals are going to compete for your paper. You often think as an author, if you're not being involved in a journal, then actually it's a one-way process. It's not that at all. The journals are desperate for your papers, and they will do anything to get them. So actually, having that dialogue early on is really, really, really important. So you need to remember, actually, you've got a big choice of which journals to go to, and you need to make sure that you get the right journal. So discuss your paper with them. Discuss your paper with them. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully we'll move on now to questions, but this is just a brief summary of what I've told you. I think it's very important that you understand there's a lot of resources available for you. You need to arm yourself. I call this the 6 Ps, which is prior planning and preparation prevents poor performance. We've seen that there's a lot of information on the journal's websites and available information for you. You need to use that data, use that information. I've talked about how you prepare your paper, how you deal with revise and resubmit. And when your paper's fully accepted, you still got work to do. And you need to remember that. And last and not least, then, happy to be contacted and look forward to the discussions afterwards. And of course, good luck.